We are very quickly going to look at recruitment and training in warfare between the years 1700 and 1900. And the first thing we're going to consider is the methods that we use to recruit soldiers. We are looking at the period 1700 to 1850 here at the moment. 1850 with the Crimean War is a bit of a turning point with recruitment and training, as it is if you look at other aspects of warfare, such as weapons, during this period too. So the methods of recruiting soldiers remained pretty much the same for most of this period, so a lot of continuity, not much change. By 1700, the start of this period, soldiers were professional soldiers. Soldiering was their job. England had a permanent standing army. By that point, remember that this was established after the English Civil Wars in 1660, after the new model. So even in peacetime, England would have a permanent standing army. And the size of the British Army tended to fluctuate during this period, go up and down, largely because of various events. For example, there were peaks in army size when Britain was involved in foreign wars, such as the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815, and of course the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, even the Boer Wars at the end of the century, 1899 to 1902. Now the British Army was initially quite small in 1700, it was about 40,000 men. One of the reasons for it being small was that the population were pretty suspicious of a large army, with the idea that the king might use it against the people. And of course this had happened in the English Civil Wars during the 1640s. So 40,000 in the army, 1700. At Waterloo, we're looking at somewhere in the region of about 250,000 in the armies there, during the wars, obviously Napoleonic Wars. It then reduces after the Napoleonic Wars back to 92,000. For the Crimean Wars, it's back up to 250,000. It reduces again in the peacetime period, and then when the Boer Wars come along, army size increases to 350,000. So it fluctuates according to need. And the textbook you're using spends a bit of time dealing with William Lawrence, who was a soldier during this period, and talks about his life and the reasons why he got involved in the army during the infantry. And you can see, go into this more about Lawrence and his reasons for enlistment on page 61 of your textbook. They tend to revolve around the fact that he didn't have a job and he needed some money, so he joined the army. So you might want to take some notes down from the slide in front of you now. It just points out various things, key features of recruitment during this period. 90% of the recruits to the British Army were illiterate in the first half of the 19th century. And you would get recruiting parties that would be made up of 3 serving soldiers who would be sent out to local fairs and public houses to try and attract recruits. And they would pay a bounty to a man who enlisted. By 1806, this was about 12 guineas, which is a substantial sum of money in those days. In fact, about 40% of the yearly income of an agricultural labourer. New recruits had to swear an oath of loyalty, committing themselves to army service to a judge before they were formally accepted into the army. This had to be done within 4 days of enlisting. The term of service that agreed was 21 years, so you were committing to a lifetime of service in the army if you joined back then. And life in the army was pretty difficult, which unsurprisingly made it difficult for the army to attract recruits. It was harsh, there was strict discipline, floggings, low pay, the drill training was boring and monotonous. And of course then you might have a battle, might not survive that, and if you went on a campaign there might be diseases. And your commitment, of course, was for 21 years. So perhaps, unsurprisingly, the army was seen by most people at the time as being the last resort for those who had little else in life. And even The Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, at the time the Duke of Wellington, said that ordinary British infantrymen were the scum of the earth. Recruiting parties remained the main way of getting hold of soldiers during this period, but there were other methods that were used, and you should probably know some of these. Soldiers were also recruited at this time from the militia, which was an organisation whose members were equipped and trained just to provide basic local defence. From 1757, counties had to provide lists of men aged 18 to 45, from which men were selected by ballot to serve in the militia for a period of 5 years. Militiamen were also encouraged to transfer to the regular army. The encouragement here was a bounty payment, which was larger than the bounty that was paid to volunteer recruits to the army. And between 1805 and 1815, 100,000 militiamen joined the regular army. Other methods included kidnap. Some men were forced to join the army. Kidnappers were known as crimps. Their incentive was the bounty money given to those who brought men forward to enlist. And crimps were most active when there was a particular need for recruits, so noticeably in the 1790s and 1800s during the Napoleonic Wars. Not surprisingly, in the army, desertion was a constant problem. Lots of desertions took place as soon as after the men had enlisted and realised that they'd made a poor choice, a poor decision. Between 1803 and 1812, 53,000 men deserted, an offence punishable by death. Recruitment was different for officers. Officers were recruited from wealthy, upper middle and aristocratic classes. It was seen as an appropriate career for the younger sons of well-to-do people, and this was handled through something called the purchase system, where it was customary for parents to purchase a commission, a position, a rank, as an officer for their sons. A lieutenant's commission, for example, could typically be purchased for upwards of £1,000. Did not have to be brave or skillful. There might well not be. There was no formal training requirement or qualifications needed. Officers were simply expected to learn through experience. Promotions were usually either purchased or were based on seniority, which is the length of period an officer had served. There was very little opportunity, although it did sometimes happen for men from the ranks, non-officers, in other words, to become officers. Now, as we've said previously and in other presentations, it's the Crimean War in the 1850s that really is a turning point here. And recruitment and training did change after 1850. So far, we've seen 150 years of very little change in terms of the way in which soldiers were recruited for the army. But in the 1850s, after mistakes in the Crimean War, this was different. Now, Britain might have been on the winning side in the Crimean War, but there wasn't much about its performance to be celebrated. Lots of problems here: poor command, tactics, mismanagement of supplies, outdated artillery. Obviously, the Battle of Balaclava and the Charge of the Light Brigade is your opportunity here to highlight those problems and those mistakes, particularly, of course, the poor command. And so in 1858, the government set up a royal commission to investigate what happened during the Crimean War, and its conclusions were that there was a failure to provide British troops with essential supplies, particularly during the winter of 1854, and also criticised the failure to recruit sufficient numbers of men to fight. And the Royal Commission resulted in growing pressure for change and reform. However, change did not occur immediately after the Crimean War. There were obstacles to it. There were vested interests within the military and parliament, where positions of power were held by a relatively small number of people, all of them privileged and wealthy, and who had little incentive to make any changes. Indeed, Britain's victory at Waterloo in 1815 also encouraged an enormous belief in the great ability and the glory of the British Army. So there were complacent attitudes. Public pressure was of limited impact, mostly because only a little over 5% of the population were allowed to vote by the time you get to the 1860s. So it actually took a further decade before changes actually were made. And we'll look at these on the next slide. When reforms did come, they were less due to the Crimean War, but actually were probably more motivated by the desire to keep up with Prussia. Now, Prussia had been increasingly perceived as a potential military and political threat in Europe during this period. Their army was large, well organised, well trained, well equipped. And the Prussians won a series of victories in European wars in the 1860s and 1870s, which led to Prussia creating and becoming the leaders of a united German nation. So that threat of Prussia probably played as big a part in the reforms that were eventually made, more so than the Crimean War debacle. When the reforms came, they were organised and introduced by Lord Cardwell, who was War Minister between 1868 and 1871. And the measures here were basically an attempt to encourage greater professionalisation within the army through reforming, recruitment, promotions, procedures. So various measures here that might be worth noting. The purchase system for officers was abolished. Promotion in the British Army was thereafter through merit. There was an increase in government control over the army. The Army Commander-in-Chief was made directly responsible to the government. There was a reduction in the enlistment period from 21 to 12 years to encourage more recruits. There was an end to the paying of bounty money for recruits too. And the structure of the army was simplified. There were 66 local regimental districts created, and each area was to have 2 battalions, one to be sent overseas, the other one to stay at home. You also saw the abolition of punishments such as flogging during peacetime, although this was still permitted on active service abroad. So, lots of change, particularly after 1850, through Lord Cardwell's reforms. Having said that, though, you need to be aware that although the Crimean War contributed towards those reforms, the motivation for those reforms, Prussia, the rise of the Prussian army, the professionalisation of the Russian army, did also make a telling contribution to why recruitment and training changed after 1850.